I'm going to introduce our main speaker, Melissa Hoover. So Melissa is the founding executive director of the Democracy at Work Institute. She calls it a think and do tank that expands worker cooperatives as a strategy to address economic and racial inequality. Now, Melissa has a long and, I think, distinguished background in cooperatives. She's worked and helped start the United States Federation of Worker Cooperatives, a national grassroots membership organization for worker-owned businesses. She was a co-op business developer for many years. She was named an executive fellow of the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, and Melissa was telling me about that organization. Sounds like somebody we should talk to. And she currently sits on the board of directors of the ICA Group, Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, the Working World, and Safe Passages of Oakland. And then just lastly, I guess Melissa is a strategic advisor to foundations, investors, nonprofits, local governments, and other organizations that want to incorporate worker ownership into their economic development and community wealth building programs. I'll just say that when Jen and I were scanning for people to kind of invite here, Melissa's videos online just popped, right? I mean, we quickly came to the conclusion she was the one we wanted, and we were going to organize this event around Melissa. So no pressure, Melissa, but come on up, please, and deliver a talk for us. Thank you.
Okay, hi. So I'm aware that you've been sitting in a windowless room for 2 hours. We'll do a little bit of participatory activity throughout so that you can stay loose and engaged. It's a little intimidating, honestly, to follow this panel of academic experts. I'm not an academic. My presentation will be more general. I'm a practitioner in my heart, in my bones, in all my activities. And it's also a little intimidating to be in such a well-developed co-op sector, well-funded, with history, with this sort of infrastructure. I think in some ways that we are catching up in the US to the Canadian co-op sector. So I guess this is all to sort of level set your expectations. So I'm going to start. And I've also put a question mark at the end of my talk just to sort of also let you know I'm not definitively speaking on the future of cooperatives in North America, but I am suggesting a few paths for us to follow together. So this slide is half here so that you can really appreciate the pun. I'm just going to pause for you to appreciate the pun. But I started, so I did my undergraduate, I'm not an academic, as I said, but I did undergraduate research on the cooperative movement in the United States, particularly the Finns in the upper Midwest, who had a fraught relationship to social movements. And there were sort of I studied the period of time when leftists entered the Finnish cooperative movement, and it's a matter of opinion whether it was as a result of that or sort of just timing, that cooperative movement fragmented. And I looked at the role of women and informal work inside of that kind of historical dynamic. So I think I've been interested in this question of how cooperatives connect to politics, but also to other institutions and systems for a very long time. I was a worker owner for several years at a worker cooperative print shop in the Bay Area. I worked as a cooperative developer, 2 successful co-ops as part of the larger Arizmendi cooperative system, which is about a $20 million cooperative complex at this point. As Marc-Andre mentioned, I was the first staffer hired by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, which now has a staff of 8. And then I moved on to found the Democracy at Work Institute, which had always been the plan. So I was sort of just realizing someone else's plan from early on. And the Democracy at Work Institute, I'll talk a little bit more about, was really founded as a driver of growth and as a laboratory for experimenting. So I'm particularly humbled because worker cooperatives are a tiny sector of a relatively small part of the US economy. We are this big. You can see this is our most recent sort of communication about it. We have 450 known worker co-ops, which is really exciting to us because it's a growth of 100 worker co-ops from 10 years ago. Over half of the worker co-ops in the United States have been started in the last 15 years. An enormous percentage of them are founded and led by women and people of color. I think it's something like 70% women in leadership. There are about 7,000 workers, about 500 million in gross revenue. For us, these are really exciting numbers. I understand that in context, they are minuscule. But I think we punch above our weight at the moment, the worker cooperative sector in the US. And I think that's because the problem we're solving, the problem we're using cooperatives to address, is the problem of work. And it's a huge problem. This question of sort of member, I'm so thrilled by the conversation because I have touch points I can just refer back to. We know we're all talking about the same thing, right? So stakeholders and member benefit as sort of the core of the cooperative identity. Well, in the worker cooperative sector, we are addressing the fact that our stakeholders, our members, are essentially locked out of good jobs and business ownership opportunities. We came about at a moment of sort of a sea change in the world of cooperatives. In the 70s and sort of through the 80s, cooperatives in the US, and maybe this is more broad, I'd be curious to know, were sort of used as a way for people with other options to exit the economy, to create an alternative. There was sort of a utopian strand. And this is just the most recent wave of growth. We can go back to the 30s and the 1800s to look at other kind of animating forces. But the most recent animating force before this wave of growth was a sort of utopian exit from the economy. We're going to go do our own thing. And over the last 20 years, what has really changed is that people are using cooperatives to enter the economy, but on their own terms and in ways that foreground their own benefit. And so that's what we are responding to, is people who are locked out of good jobs and ownership opportunities using the co-op form to create those things for themselves. This is a picture of the first national conference that we had. I love this picture because it looks like people are voting, right? They're raising their hands. But actually what they're doing is signaling whether they need interpretation or have interpretation. So this was the first conference that we did bilingually because probably, I don't know for sure, but more than half of the most recent co-ops are people who primarily speak Spanish. So we grew this membership organization, and then out of it, this driver, this laboratory for change. Then we're having a moment. Excuse me. This graph shows the blue mountain, our entrance into the worker cooperative space. The orange bars are the percentage of those entrants that are not startup cooperatives, but existing businesses that have converted to worker ownership as a way to retain the business. So you see there's a sort of, this is from 2003 to 2017, so the last sort of 15 years. You see a sort of steady growth. And that's what, it's not just a sort of a numbers growth, there's a qualitative difference, as I said, in who's starting cooperatives. We can look back sort of over the history of co-ops, this sine wave in the United States. And one of my mentors always says, well, our challenge is to survive the good times, right? Co-ops start in bad times. The challenge is to survive the good times. But I actually don't know that that's true anymore because we see the sine wave sort of getting more compressed. So there are maybe more good times, more bad times, but there's also just generally growing inequality, lack of access to good jobs, growing racialized wealth gaps. So I think that even the good times now are foregrounded by a sort of this consolidation in our economy that is driving people to create these new forms. And cooperatives have always arisen to fill market gaps. They meet needs that aren't met by the private sector or government. And this looks different in different places at different times, but it's really our through line on that sine wave. So this is all to speak to the recent past and then the more distant past. But what I've really been asked to speak to is the future, right? So the future is... right? We're not sure. This is from the Thunder Road, the dystopian movie. And this is sort of, honestly, a very real representation of how I feel when I think about the future. It's pretty bleak between climate change and economic consolidation, growing inequality, migration, the rise of fascism and the right, climate change, wars, recession, climate change. We are going to see, I think, more and more crises. And something jumped out at me from the page of the Center for Study of Cooperatives. The most pressing problems facing society are not moral, but institutional. And I see this is sort of sets a framework for me that helps me understand where cooperatives fit as institutions and as institutions that engage with other institutions. So when I think about the future, it may well be true that the cockroaches are the only thing left in 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. But I actually don't think it's all that bleak. And so I want to start with a project that I've been privileged to work on in California, just as a way of sort of framing maybe another way of thinking about the future. So this slide is farm workers who work in table grapes in California. And I love it because all the problems live here. They are big, big problems. Grapes are affected by climate change, by land stewardship policies, by trade policy. More than half of the California grapes ship to the Asian market, so tariffs and trade policy really affect how the industry works. They're affected by migration policy. 99% of farm workers in California come from south of the border. There's been corporate consolidation in the industry. A few major companies own what were never really family farms, but were much smaller farms. The workforce is dealing with all kinds of pressures of their own. Labor organizing is at play in the grape fields in all kinds of complex ways. The Central Valley has the worst air quality in the country. Children don't have access to clean water. There's inadequate housing. It's very expensive, high rates of disease and sort of public health issues. And that all lives in these beautiful grape in the fields. And these are women who are picking grapes. They're protecting themselves with masks because pesticides get sprayed on the fields every morning at 4. They come on the fields at 6 and start picking grapes. So we made a really big, not entirely successful attempt at worker ownership in this industry. We used an employee trust model, worked with an anchor grower. We worked with community organizing groups to build a workforce development pipeline. It was a big systems change project. It was very difficult. It did not pan out for a number of reasons. It didn't create a sort of the utopian cooperative we might have been hoping for. It ran into the market. It ran into human failings. It ran into systems that were not designed to accommodate it at all, and which it couldn't really figure out how to fit into. But it tried. We learned a lot from it, and we're iterating and trying again. So for me, this slide represents a second option of the future, one that's slightly less bleak and desiccated, but still pretty difficult. It's really engaged with the problems of our time, addressing them systemically. And if we make it to this vision of the future, if we do have an option B, that will be because we have figured out how to ground our economic activity in a system of values and principles. Does that sound familiar to anyone? I hope so. That's what cooperatives do, right? And so we're looking at the economic activity of picking, packing, shipping grapes and everything around that, and saying, how do we do this in a values-based way? Because what has been done until now for decades, centuries, has not been values-based, and it's destroyed the land, it's destroyed the people, it's destroyed the economy in some pretty significant ways. How can we choose a more regenerative path? We can do it by marrying economic activity and value. So I'm preaching to the choir here, you know this. And yet the two are always being cleaved apart. Some of our biggest struggles are when we try to articulate one over the other, right? This is values. No, this is economic activity. Or we try to choose what economic activity versus values. It's this either or thinking. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm studying polarity management right now, and it's really informing my thinking. So with a polarity, you actually need both ends of that pole, right, in order to do the thing. So to illustrate that and to wake you up a little bit, I want to do a breathing exercise, right? So first we are going to so we're going to sit up straight, get ready to breathe. First we're just going to only breathe in, okay? Let's breathe in as much as you can. Keep breathing in. It's good, breathing in is great, right? You need to do it, yeah. Okay, but you can't just breathe in, right? So breathe, okay, now let's try breathing out. Okay, breathe out. Keep breathing out. Yeah, keep breathing out, right? I love breathing out. It's such a relief from breathing in. Right. You can't do it. You need to breathe out and breathe in, right? And to have a debate about what's better, breathing out or breathing in, right, is ridiculous. You laugh, right? So keep that laughter because it's the same response that you should have to the cleaving of values from economic activity. It's laughable. You must have them both together. So I want to take us through some potential polarities and see if we can sort of apply the same mindset. So self-interest on the one hand, right? And then on the other, we have altruism. Are you acting out of self-interest or altruism? This is when co-ops get in a fight with each other, it usually is there's some strand of this in it, right? We had to act in self-interest. We're facing financial pressures. We couldn't just do altruism. And my proposition is that values actually align these. If you have sort of the proper value, the right value statement, it pulls these together, these polarities, into a mutually dependent relationship. Similar polarity between democratic participation or this question of autonomy with financial return or efficiency, right? We can't just sit around and talk about something all day. If we involve everyone, if it's a consultative process, that's going to dent our bottom line. And similarly, all you care about is the bottom line. You haven't, come to speak to us about this. There hasn't been adequate participation. So it's this question of autonomy versus performance that was coming up earlier. And we even see this in advocacy. So the two kind of candidates who have picked up the banner of shared ownership in some way in the US in our presidential race, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, Warren talks about co-determination and worker participation on boards and sort of the German model of bringing workers into participation. Sanders talks about ownership and financial return and the sort of the economic part of it. And that's how when they talk about scale, they are speaking in two separate directions. Not a one of them has spoken about those things together in a meaningful way. And I think if we're going to move beyond the transactional to the transformative, we have to be able to pull both ends of those pools together. So I'm going to argue, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to argue that the real benefit of cooperative ownership is a both and. And this is obvious. It's really easy to say. It's very hard to do. So you may listen to this talk and think to yourself, like, I think about this all day, every day. Why is this person telling me this? Or what a Pollyanna? Or what about the trade-offs? What about the real-world pressures that my business is facing or that I have been a part of? And my challenge to you is, as you're listening, to think about it, to remember the breathing exercise and think about not either this is obvious or there's no way this is possible, but sort of the how. How do we operationalize the obvious? Because it's easy to say and hard to do. How do we actually put this into practice? So, as your brain is being tickled or resisting or excited about these concepts, I want you to go practical with it and think about how it actually works. And what I want to propose is that we are ambitious in a couple really key areas in the co-op movement, that we contend for space, the power of ideas, the power of actual hard cash and financial space, and the power of people organized together toward a common purpose, and that there is power available to us and that we need to take it and use it wisely. So I think we're not ambitious enough in the cooperative world, and I'm speaking from the US context, so I hope to be humbled and informed by the Canadian context. So for me, the both and is the ambition itself, is to say we can accept an either-or world where we're either efficient or autonomous, but when we do that, it impoverishes our strategy, and it shuts down the questions we should ask ourselves about how cooperatives can be agents of change. So I want the both and to be our central ambition. This is itself our goal. How do we pull these things together? It elevates the strategy. It's generative, right? It's doing so, asking questions this way engenders our creativity. It requires a certain rigor of application. You have to look for the new answer. And this is how we redefine systems, is by rejecting the either or and pulling in the both and. So one other polarity that I think is going to inform my second ambition is this polarity between enterprise and system, which we just spent a really fruitful hour and a half discussing. And again, don't think it's actually an opposition. If it's done right, the system adds value to the enterprise is integral to the system. But how do we actually do that? Our ambition needs to encompass institutions and systems to even begin to have a language for how enterprise and system work together. So there's a thing that goes on in the US, I'm not sure if it's true here, and it's a piece of my context for this, which is that there's this sort of savior hope for the cooperative. Like, it's going to solve all your problems. It has to do a lot of heavy lifting. People will tell you, oh, it's a co-op, as if that sort of magically mitigates the human tendencies that we have or the external pressures that are on us. What's a co-op? Cooperatives alone, certainly not at the enterprise level, are not going to save us. And if we hope that they do, and if we act like they're going to, we overburden them with a kind of pressure that's not productive to my thinking. So we can't do it alone. It's not just the enterprise level, it's at the system level that we need to engage our thinking and all of our cooperative values and skills. The system is actually a support and a release valve. I've done well, a support and a release valve for some of these tensions of the different polarities. And by that I mean, I think we need to connect outside of the cooperative world to other systems of support, other value systems, other financial systems. No cooperative complex anywhere in the world has scaled without a systems approach, right? Without relating to its industry, its location, its politics. It has to engage those other systems in order to be successful. So what do I mean by systems of support? Well, traditional entrepreneurs are not going it alone. So I live in Silicon Valley, which is like ground zero for veneration of the individual entrepreneur. It drives me crazy. So let's just take this Bill Gates, avuncular Bill Gates now, right? He's lovable now. He's sort of at the end of his career. He's a good guy, started the Gates Foundation. He's done an incredible amount of work. Has he done it alone? No, we all know that he hasn't done it alone. But let's look at the systems that have enabled Bill Gates to do what all he has done. Tax policy, right? Corporate tax policy allowed Microsoft to grow, to sort of maintain its resource base. Economic development incentives, a part of tax policy, added to tax policy, helped Microsoft to locate where it located and to create the jobs that it did. That's a system that it's taking advantage of. Capital was there, an investor model, served Bill Gates very well, served Microsoft well, both early sort of venture capital and then later on the markets in publicly traded capital. Schooling created a workforce that allowed Microsoft to sort of tap those talents and skills, right? Those people were trained for their jobs. The workforce itself was available, it was ready. If we can take a lot of these things on a very surface level and just say, sure, of course, the system is built to produce workers who create value. But I think we need to step it back a little bit, and especially in the US context, understand that the workforce actually has an historical trajectory going back 200, 300 years, where a solid percentage of the workforce was treated as if it was property, right? These people were not paid or compensated for their work. They were brought over and generated wealth, which then down the line enables the kind of institutions to be built that allow more wealth creation. So slavery is what we grapple with in the US. It's more widespread than that, but it's particularly live for me in a lot of the work that I do. Speaking of the workforce, there are probably, work is changing and the gendered nature of work is changing, but who was doing the non-productive labor for Bill Gates? Who was taking care of his kids and who was taking care of the kids of all of the primarily early workforce, primarily male at Microsoft, right? So who's maintaining the home? That's labor. And we don't see it. We often don't sort of recognize it, but it's there. Land use. The sort of land use policies and zoning allowed workers to live closer to Microsoft. We can also step that one back and ask whose land Microsoft is on, whose land is the United States on, and was there adequate compensation for that land? No. Media and culture sort of support the idea of like, Bill Gates is a brilliant guy. You want to buy technology. Sort of the model of successful sort of businessmen is to make as much money as you can. There are sort of these messages reinforced throughout, and et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. The idea is not to point out only, not only to point out that Bill Gates is a very privileged guy and has availed himself of all these systems. It's to say that there are systemic supports for maximizing profit. A system based on that value has been very successful. It's an enormously successful system at some things, and it is growing and consolidating. It sets the terms that the rest of us do business on. But is it, I think in Murray's words, is it adapted to the future conditions that the world creates? Is this the best system for the future? So, as I said, the point is not to call out Bill Gates or even call out Microsoft, but to show that when the pieces of a system orient toward a common purpose, it can really do a thing. It's just that the purpose isn't quite the right one, in my view. And moreover, when co-ops try to do what we do within that system, we can get crushed. Which isn't to say that we're not competitive in the market. We are a market-based solution, but we cannot compete in the market as is. Why? Because the market is wired toward profit maximization for publicly held corporations. That's a fact. So if we want to really succeed as co-ops, but also if we want to transform the way work and business is done, we have to push the system to reorient to our values, as profit maximizers have pushed it to orient to their values. So that's for me. I may have lost you at this point. I may be like a wild, flaming radical, but I believe that we, for our own business purposes, as well as for our transformative values, must move beyond that sort of either or that tears us apart and move toward both doing our work, being competitive, and pushing the parts of the system that can support something like Microsoft. So we'll take Bill out of the picture. And we see that really it's the system that remains, right? It fosters many, many, many Bill Gateses and many Microsofts. But what does it look like when it's regenerative? What does it look like for each of these things to orient toward a cooperative value system and a cooperative business system? How would we use economic development incentives? What would we even ask for at the local level? What kind of media and culture do we need? What sort of schooling? This institute is one of the answers to that, right? The sort of schooling that trains people in the very questions we're grappling with today, which are not sort of typically studied. What sort of workforce and family structures could support a cooperative ownership world? What might we ask for out of capital? What would appropriate capital look like for cooperative investment? So these are the pieces of the system that I think we can adapt to future conditions, that we can and should adapt to our future conditions and really envision what we want and then push on them to do what they need to do to support cooperative development. So working with and within partnerships and identifying ourselves as larger entities that also share some of these interests and values is sort of how I see the next evolution, and connecting our values to member and community benefit. We don't have to hold all of these tensions ourselves. We are working alongside partners who share similar interests. So how do we get there? This is the question about federations, to me. This is the question about federations and relationships. I think they're critically important. They are sort of how we get from individual co-op enterprises or even co-op enterprise systems to working alongside other partners who share our interests and can exert pressure on those things is through our federated models. So our federations both serve the enterprises, but they also face outward to leverage all of that sort of people power and capital in favor of cooperative values. So my challenge to you, what is the role of our own institutions, not just in serving our cooperatives and making them stronger, but in brokering partnerships that make us stronger across the board? And so one of the ways we might do this is looking back through history. The present demand of the Crispin is steady employment and fair wages, but his future is self-employment. The germ of the future is seeded into the present demand, right? There's an awareness that we're designing a system for the future, not just the present. But what does any of this have to do with research? A lot of big thoughts to get you thinking. I think what it has to do with research is that the questions that we ask matter for how we think about that future system. Research is how we know ourselves. It's not just sort of data on a page, right? It shapes the story that we tell. What was the conflict? What is the three-part framework for governance? What was at play there? It's a way of explaining and describing the world that's really critically important for gaining legitimacy, for advocating for ourselves. And it's why I was so happy to see the research agenda for the center, actually. So I noticed the research agenda is taxation, innovation, governance, economic justice, and sustainability, right? These sort of 5 points, if I have it right. So taxation and governance, okay, those are kind of co-op wonky. Like, those are going to be about co-ops, right? Innovation, a little bit broader, probably about co-ops and business. Economic justice and sustainability, well, those start to get at our wheel, start to get at our system. And so I think that the role of research specifically is to ask the question about member benefit. Who benefits and how? To ask the question about governance, who gets to decide and how? These are co-op specific questions, but they also inform how we relate to the institutions that we're building. So asking those questions will lead us to the story of systems and institutions. It will lead to telling those stories and telling them better than they have been told in the past. It brings the polarities together. And I think that the role of research is really, this is strictly from a practitioner's perspective, to translate our concepts into more universal touchstones, right? If we natter on about patronage and equity, we're just like losing our partners, right? But if we talk about like sharing ownership, sharing profits, that pulls people, oh, okay, we can see that. If we talk about doing business in a better way, protecting workers, delivering benefits to communities, those are the kinds of things that help relate cooperatives to other interests and other benefits, other social movements, but also other institutions of power. So just a brief sort of self-promotion here. The Democracy at Work Institute does research like this. We do it in partnership with academic institutions, and we do some of it on our own in the field. And it's always geared toward an audience that may or may not know anything about cooperatives. So becoming employee-owned is for business owners who want to sell to their employees. Legacy business is for cities that want to explore how to root and retain their small business through shared ownership. We have some other things that you can't read because they're a little bit fuzzy. But so we do research on the state of the sector and then frame creating better jobs and a fairer economy with worker cooperatives. That's the sort of, and it's backed up by research. So it's that, again, that emphasis on practice. So I'll wrap up with a brief story about my own polarities. When I was younger, I really rejected a lot of the systems change language, a lot of the cultural work, leadership work. I even had very little patience for governance and participation. I was in favor of focusing on economic returns. I thought this is the only thing that really matters. Cooperatives are born out of need. I come from a working class background. Don't talk to me about participation. I just want to know, am I going to get paid and are people going to am I going to be able to build wealth? And the people I work with, I thought that was hardcore. It was a rejection of the sort of prevailing hippie norms that were present in the US cooperative movement at the time, my own biases, and an impulse to establish that worker cooperatives could be scalable, viable businesses. You don't hear people talking about participation and governance, at least in our context, when they're wanting to show what a successful business they are. They're talking about their returns. And so that's where I came from. Perhaps it's the political moment we're in. Perhaps it's a maturation process. But I'm returning to the value of values now. I've sort of coming back to that as a really important part of how we talk about things. Part of it is that I read this framework, that fascism arises when economic systems are in crisis, when that world is fraying, and people want a sort of a certainty and an answer. And guess what, folks? Economic systems are in crisis. And we have a choice, and it's a choice about values and institutions. And I think economic activity is the bedrock of cooperatives. We are not building discussion clubs. These are not advocacy organizations. We're doing economic activity. So that's the first part. That's the bread of the sandwich, the meat of the sandwich, whatever the crust of the pie. We're doing economic activity, but how we're doing it matters. It's not transactional only. It's transformative as well. And so I think our competitive advantage is leveraging that value statement, right? The idea that it's not either values or economic competitiveness. It's not appeal to consumers or having some sort of wild idealism, that actually the wild idealism may appeal to consumers, that maybe the value statement is part of economic competitiveness, and that there is a structural relationship between those two that we need to honor and sort of draw out. So a lot of big thoughts. We're back to our cockroach, right? We're sort of post-apocalyptic. The only thing alive on the planet is a cockroach. And so they might be the only thing left in 50 or 100 years, but let's learn from them, right? So my brother, I'm going to play you a little video that my brother, he's a researcher and an engineer, and he studies cockroaches. And he studies them because he designs robots that are based on their principles. And cockroaches are really cool, it turns out. They have a lot going for them. They have a branding problem. They're a little bit like co-ops in this way. So we'll watch the video, and then I'll explain to you what happened. So it looks like the cockroach. Let's play it one more time. That's the moment, and if you can pause it right when right there. That's the moment that he studies, right here. Because that's the moment where the cockroach, so to you, it looks like cockroach just ran up the wall, right? We've seen it, it's gross, we don't want to see more of that. But what he studies is the moment actually where the cockroach bangs its head into the wall 5 times, and with each bang adjusts its velocity and its position until it figures out how to get up the wall. So you see it run up the wall. What you don't see is all the work behind it, the calculation and the velocity to get up the wall. So they're really tenacious. They're built for survival, and they adapt to the conditions that they're faced with. They also seem to do the impossible. One thing we've learned about cockroaches is that they actually conserve energy on the upswing. So this seems to violate the laws of physics. They get more energy as they go. They can go faster. It's why you see cockroaches accelerate in this really intense way, because they're saving energy as they pull their arm up. They're innovators. As I think it was Marc-Andre and I were talking about earlier, they burrow in to open up new niches. So they build the market, if you will, for their products. And they're systems organism. They're always working together. You know that if you see one cockroach, there are probably a lot more, right? So they work in groups, and they work with other animals in symbiotic relationships. So I think we can learn from that tenacity, from the conservation of energy, from the innovation, and from the systems approach, that we should be more like cockroaches. So for me, and the cockroach is a humble a humble form. It's not a glamorous form. They're a difficult animal. As I said, they have some branding issues. So to me, there's a real parallel with our work in that we need to be ambitious, right? Clearly, cockroaches are aiming to take over the world. They're everywhere. We need to be like that. Let's set our ambition. But it's a deep, unglamorous, practical, difficult ambition. And that is to engage with the world we're in on values and economics at the same time. We can adjust, we can recalibrate, let's run at that wall again, and let's do it with as many of our institutions by our side as we can marshal. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was fantastic. We have a panel set up for a conversation about Melissa's talk. So I'd like to invite the panelists up, Mitchell, Audra, and Zion. Okay, so I'll just introduce our panel. We'll open it up to Q&A after the panel discussion. So I'll start with Mitchell. Mitchell is the chair and consultant at Align Consulting Cooperative. He's also a minister at the United Church of Canada, a recent transition, so congratulations. I meant to mention that on the email. He's also on the board of Affinity Credit Union and SAS Central. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation, Mitchell. We have Audra Kruger, Executive Director at Co-ops First and formerly involved with the Centre in the past. So welcome, Audra. And of course, Dion, an Associate Professor at the University of Toronto and formerly of the Centre as well. And this completes our panel. So I think the question I suggested we address as a starting conversation was just to get your reflections on what you've just heard from Melissa. So maybe I can start with you, Mitchell.
Thank you. I think where I would begin is maybe just a few bit of my own story of how I came to be involved in so many cooperatives was you have to go back, I think, 5 generations. I was looking at the old census and my great-great-grandfather was listed as, his occupation was hunter and his place of work was furs. Which aren't occupations that really exist much more. And he was the negotiator on behalf of the English River First Nation for Treaty 10. And there's 2 phrases in Treaty 10 that really stand out to me. One is that the treaty was to secure the bounty and benevolence of Canada for our people in exchange for access to our territories. And the other was to secure peace and goodwill between Canada, this emerging country, and the Dene and other peoples of Treaty 10. And then, 5 generations later, I grew up crushingly poor. To 2 teen parents, and my only friends when I was young were books. Not my only friends. My main friends when I was young were books. So my parents were looking for a summer camp where they could get me out of the house, maybe make some friends. And the local credit union, Meadow Lake Credit Union, now Innovation Credit Union, was willing to pay all the costs to send me to something called the Cooperative Youth Program, or co-op camp. And 2 days later, I find myself the chair of the co-op tuck shop that we have, and sort of got the taste for governance, the taste for co-ops, and find myself here. But I think that my story, I don't think, is the usual story I hear about people involved in the cooperative system. I don't often hear, for a really mature and successful system, people who grew up in poverty, people who are young, people who are Indigenous. And my dream for the future of the system is that we need to look more like the province. We need to look more like, we need to look younger, browner, more urban, more like the Saskatchewan that we're becoming, and celebrating the people who've created us, but being prepared for a future that's ahead. And so was what was sitting with me during that talk about a different context, but with its own challenges around crushing racial inequality and income inequality, and cooperatives as part of the solution. I think that cooperatives can be part of the solution about building the sort of Canada that my late great-great-grandfather aspired when he set up Treaty 10.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk. That was wonderful to hear. I have, a story where I was attracted to co-ops, and my first experience working in a co-op was not because it was a co-op, it was because of what it did, and it was the Core Neighborhood Youth Co-op, working in an older neighborhood in Saskatoon, and it was all about addressing the economic question and also about racial inequality with mostly First Nations kids in the inner city. And I remember thinking, going to my interview, it's like, okay, there was the board and co-op, I know about the credit union, I got to brush up on what the heck this co-op thing is. But since then, I've had a lot of experience in both board of directors and helping being involved in co-ops, the car share co-op. Where's Heather? Lots of late night meetings, working out bylaws and exciting stuff like that. And also, how are we going to make this thing fly? And so now I'm the executive director of the Cooperatives First. And so we work in Western Canada with First Nations and rural folks on promoting the cooperative model and educating, so inspiring. So this was a very inspiring talk, thank you. But we also work with the nitty gritty of helping them to get their co-op off the ground. And so, I have a question for you that's just all about us, really, and I'm here I want to pick your brain. I can't wait to talk to you some more. But so I went and looked, and looking at the worker co-op aspect of what we do, we're working with about 7 groups. We are working with 7 groups that are worker co-ops. And they range from everything from, a store succession in an urban area, tree planters, midwives, really high capacity, highly educated young people working on disaster preparedness, artists, etc. So for them, something that really stuck with me was your point about the problem of work. All these folks seem to have in common that they're really trying to solve that problem of work. So we, as a new organization, we're only 3 years old, we kind of run into, all of us on our staff are passionately pragmatic. So we're prairie people, we want to help solve problems. So we have that tension, and you mentioned it with the savior hope. We get the people saying, well, it's a co-op, so it's just going to work out and be great. So, advice for me as the executive director and also my staff to bring that to them. What are some of the challenges that sort of the nitty-gritty pragmatic challenges? You mentioned the great pickers and the big systems change, the market, human failures, and systems. But what other kinds of bits of advice can you give to folks wanting to start worker co-ops, or myself as the leader of an organization wanting to inspire and create more co-ops?
Let her answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did I go rogue?
It's okay.
That's how I roll.
No, let her answer that. Yeah.
What advice to give people who want to start worker co-ops? My own thinking on this is in flux. So just to be transparent, I used to be pretty hard-nosed about scare them, scare them and help them understand that this is actually, there's risk, talk right up front about the risk, talk about the, sort of business, the business imperatives that you'll have to know, focus only on the business at first, level expectations to this is going to be harder than anything you want. Not only is this co-op not going to save you, it's going to, it'll probably eat up your life, and then, you might not make as much money. And if they're still around at the end of that, but I've been told that's discouraging. So I might back off of that a little bit. And I think it's also, it was a reaction to a certain kind of sort of dreamy, it's just, sort of, it's all going to work out because it's a co-op. And I wanted to say business is hard. I've some of the worst and most difficult things I've ever done have been in a business. And we heard a lot about that this afternoon too. So I think that still stands, but I think especially when you're working with people who have been totally locked out of opportunity, they don't need more scaring about how hard everything is, because they know, and B, there's a certain kind of so what, let's get to it, that I've experienced when working with people who really have nothing to lose. And so I don't actually think that's the full answer. I still think it's part of the answer. Scare them, make it hard. But I think the second part of the answer is really find people's strengths and go from a sort of an appreciative inquiry approach. What do you know how to do? What can you do? How can you hustle on that? How can you do it well? I mean, we frame it, we work with a lot of young people who relate to the language of hustle. They're hustling already to pull it together. So it's a matter of translating that and making it sort of a shared hustle. I think we have done a disservice to the people that we've worked with as co-op developers when we haven't done both of those things together. So again, with the polarities, if you do one or the other, it's probably either discouraging or false hope promising. Maybe it's a part of the practice is to do them both and to sort of hold that line. The other thing I would say is know what you're doing. Right? If you don't know what you're doing with financial projections, with governance, with management, you're taking on a huge responsibility. And so you have to, your house has to be in order. And I've seen too many cooperative developers kind of get like run off half-cocked or know some but not all. And I think the same rigor that you would apply to running the business has to be applied to the work of cooperative development. So, I don't know, that's probably all very discouraging.
So, Melissa, I just loved your talk. I'm so inspired. There's so many things. I think my immediate reaction in terms of how it spoke to me, I grew up in sort of more northeastern Saskatchewan, so about 2 hours from Saskatoon. I was the oldest of 9. We were a farming family. We were fairly subsistence farming and earlier in my life, and co-ops, they really were sort of tools that they provided goods and services. They were economic tools. Everything about them was very pragmatic, and I think that. And then I went to a business school, and most of my education has been in business schools. My first job as a professor was at the Edwards School of Business across the street, and really everything to me was always about sort of that economic rationale, right? And that co-ops solve pragmatic problems for people, their economic problems. And I think what I loved about your talk was it actually really did hit a nerve, in the sense that, economic systems and economic solutions, they really are a means to an end, ultimately. And so this idea of not seeing it as either or, right? So I was always somebody who said, who cares about these rainbow co-op principles, but it is sort of about this idea about not thinking about either or. It is both and sort of that the economic solution, which that co-ops can provide, it really is a means to an end. What is that end, right? It's the values, it's the way that we want to organize society, it's how we want to relate to each other, it's the relationships we want to build, and that actually is fundamentally part of it, right? To have that conversation, you require to have both conversations. It's about sort of embedding those values in whatever economic system we're creating. So I think that was just excellent. And then I just think the other thing that I would just say is that, at the Center for the Study of Co-ops, a couple of years ago when I was here, Federated was really sort of forward-thinking in funding a project, the Co-op Innovation Project, which actually ultimately led to the creation of Co-ops First, which they also funded, this co-op business development organization that focuses really on rural settler and rural Indigenous communities across Western Canada. And I think that they were thinking about this question of where do we want to be in the future? Because ultimately there was no sort of real rationale to do it. At that time, there wasn't really an economic reason, at least in the moment, to do it. It was them looking forward as a board and as a system and saying, what's important for the future? What do we need to focus on? And I think that project and Co-ops First really is sort of struggling with this question about how to sort of deal with the systems around a co-op development. How do we create the systems? Because we looked around and the people at Federated and then the system looked around, and now the people in Co-ops First are looking around saying all of the systems are definitely supporting a particular form of business formation. And so as a result, that's why you see so many of these investor-owned businesses forming, or the heroic single entrepreneur, as opposed to thinking about collective entrepreneurship. So just even the ideas being embedded in that. So I just felt like this idea that no system is scaled without expanding systems of support, that was really fundamental to that decision several years ago that I think was still so forward-thinking for a group of mostly really pragmatic farmers. And not all of them, I shouldn't say that, that's actually not true, but a lot of them. And so so many things came into my mind from your conversation, and those would be a couple.
It's one of the things, so we have a staff of 13 people. I am the second oldest person on our staff. and I'm 44 years old. So the people that work with me are anywhere from 23 to 40, mostly in their late 20s and early 30s. And I learned so much from them about the way things are not working, right? Like the world that they have grown up in, their assumptions are fundamentally different than even mine, right? I grew up in a time when the world was just starting to like really not work for your average sort of mainstream white American. And their world has been falling apart since the moment they were born, right? They have known about climate change. They were born into recessions. Their racial wealth inequality has grown. And so for them, this idea, there's just data. It's like sort of both the air they breathe and the data around them that like this current system is not working. It's intuitive to them to look for a new kind of support and to see where it's not working. And I want to relate that to this question of culture. One of the things that kept coming up for me in your talk was the culture change, or pieces of what we call culture, and I think is both culture and systems working together. And when I want to make the case, the employee ownership world in the US is really good at this, making this case, and it has to do with the research. A lot of times I think we're tempted to focus on research that is financial, right? And say, this is the quantitative research. But I think if we bring a similar rigor to this question of culture and to the question of how supports are built in and sort of how humans act in working with each other, it takes us to new questions. So for instance, the employee ownership world, the ESOPs in the US have done this like 3-year longitudinal study on productivity and profitability, and they found, and participation. So those three things together, and they found that the more participatory ESOPs, which are not mandated to be participatory, it's just a stock ownership plan, the more participatory ESOPs have higher productivity and higher profitability. And so that's a numbers question, but it's also a culture question because they looked at what constitutes participation, how does that work? And so they're bringing a rigor of analysis that I think is really critical, that the field itself, we know this in the field, but we can't prove it. We need an academic to come in and study us with the methodology and sort of draw and analyze and draw the conclusions. So those are two very different responses to what you're saying, but I think that they both have to do with the questions that you're asking about the world we live in.
Perfect. So I might open it up now to the audience if anyone has a question for the panelists or for Melissa. Any questions? Yes, go Jen.
Okay,
Thank
so,
you.
Interested in trying to this idea of making our cooperative sector here in Saskatchewan younger, browner, how do you have recommendations on how to do that? And do you have any indication in the US that existing cooperatives have successfully kind of make themselves younger and browner, or do younger brown people have to create their own co-ops? Like what do we do? Do you have ideas, either of you?
Well, I think the we is the important part of that question, because who is the we? I think what we do in rooms like this is build those support systems, leverage our proximity to capital, policy, research, and enable the creation and support the creation of those cooperatives by people who are doing it. I will say, in the US at least, the sort of legacy co-ops have not diversified, for lack of a better word, and I don't think that's a problem necessarily. I think what we're seeing is a wave of people starting co-ops from the low-wage sectors, from communities of color, women, who are starting them to meet their needs. Like, they don't want to join, I don't know, construction co-op that already exists of, like, the sort of older generation of mostly men who are mostly white. If they did, that would be a different kind of conversation. But what we're seeing is like people starting co-ops in their industries to meet their needs. And so I think it's tricky to talk about. I think I'm less interested or less able to speak to how you take middle-class white institutions and diversify them, and more about how you build an ecosystem that supports, welcomes, and encourages the creation of co-ops by low-wage workers, by people of color. I will say there's something interesting going on in the U.S., which is turning all of this on its head, which is the conversion of existing businesses. So who owns most businesses in the U.S.? It's something like 90% white men. Who works in most businesses in the U.S.? Not 90% white men. And so there is a sort of automatic, at the point of ownership transition, an automatic shift in co-op ownership, but it retains some of the DNA of the previous business. So it's not, these are just like regular businesses whose workers maybe had a strong culture and access to capital and wanted to convert them, but they are not necessarily co-op true believers, and so they don't have a lot of that kind of starry-eyed optimism about, well, it's a co-op. They're like, I want to keep my job and I want to run this business, and we have the capacity to do that. And that is actually changing the co-op culture more than anything else, more than the startups, more than integrating new workers and new generations of people into old co-ops. So I would keep my eye on that trend, and I think it's happening in Canada a little bit too, this conversion, because you've got this baby boomer wave that's retiring and all these businesses are going to close. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you for the question. I would note that two of the cooperatives I'm part of, Affinity Credit Union and Credit Union Central Saskatchewan, we find our roots in a previous cooperative that no longer exists, the Wheat Pool, but it was Wheat Pool agents like Harold and his coworkers who started most of the credit unions that are now Affinity or that have built the wealth that is now Sask Central. So it was a previous generation of cooperatives that built the legacy cooperatives today. And so I think that there's a principle 6, but also a moral and practical obligation for the established co-ops today to nurture and foster the next generation of cooperatives. Coordinated youth co-op's a bit older, but like that, or the bike co-op, or the car share co-op, or the brewing co-op, that there's this sort of generation of new cooperatives that I think do speak to that they do look more like who Saskatchewan is now. But as someone on the board of some of our established cooperatives, I do have this concern about how do we stay relevant and how do we continue to thrive in a changing province. And I think that it requires a willingness to, on previous generations, to relinquish power to make space, to say, the best thing for the cooperative might be for established people to transition to new ways of serving the cooperative system, to make room for more young people, more women, more people of color and Indigenous people. And that's hard, but I think that that's part of the being relevant to looking like the future customer base if we want to be successful businesses.
Fantastic. Audra, John, you want to jump in on this at all? Or if you
Just quickly on the conversion thing, actually there's a big SSHRC grant at the University of Toronto that I'm part of with the Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education, and they are studying conversions en masse across the country right now. So it's an interesting, relevant topic. I know Co-ops First is also, this is something they keep talking about in terms of succession planning with people who are sort of thinking about retiring and how to transition their businesses. So it's an interesting concept or topic here right now too.
All right, sorry, go ahead.
I find with conversions actually that it forces us to clarify and articulate what the real benefit is, because these are not people who are interested in the co-op as the co-op. They might be, but you got to sell it to them. Like, why? And so I think there's it's a clarifying moment for us and a really helpful trend.
Yes, a question over here. I'll just bring you the microphone. 1 second.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you for your talk. I was really impressed with the slide with all the people with their hands raised. I think you said 47% needed a Spanish interpreter there. That seemed incredibly high to me, and I was just very impressed. And I was wondering are these recent immigrants from Latin America bringing knowledge of cooperatives with the historical, their historical knowledge of cooperatives that are based already in Latin America, or is it through organizations such as yours that are reaching out to them and saying, oh, these are some options?
It's a little bit of both, and I think. Like, people are definitely, there is a history of cooperatives in Latin America. People are bringing that. It really depends where you're coming from, though, because there's also a very corrupt history of cooperatives in Latin America. So in Venezuela, they're sort of seen as state instruments. There was this like massive investment, but they may or may not be real. In certain parts of Mexico, the ejidos are like this sort of agricultural production cooperative that people have worked on. So I think you can't make a single generalization, but yes, that's very clearly a strand.
So are you finding you have obstacles to overcome?
Yeah,
for people?
absolutely.
Because they have these, because I've been in other countries where people
Yeah.
think unions as well are just rackets. They're like the mob, and
Right.
like to your point as well in parts of South America.
Yeah. And I think it polarizes around political ideology, which is something I'm concerned about, I guess, in the U.S. That and this is one of the things we see in conversions is people like, oh, that's a leftist thing, that's communism. Particularly with people who come from former communist countries or current communist countries, have a real nervousness about it. And so, for us, the best response that we found to that is just to get practical. This is how it works. This is the actual mechanism of your voice, of profit distribution, of investment, but it's the investment that's the deal breaker. People are like, you want money from me, but I work for you. Like, it's just, it doesn't always fly. And then I think there are a decent wave of growth has come not just from the cooperative development organizations, but from other advocacy organizations. So immigrants' rights organizations, home care and the care economy in general are looking for some kind of business model that works in a really exploitative industry. The unions have found unorganizable groups of people because either they're independent contractors or they don't have legal status to work in the US or any number of reasons, and they're looking for a form through which to organize. So it's actually, I think, less maybe co-op people driving that and more other social movements, but also social service agencies, the political, that kind of stuff is bringing immigrants into the co-op movement in pretty big numbers.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Anyone have a burning question they want to ask? Going once, twice, 3 times. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you to the panel. And thank you to everyone who came out today. Really appreciate your support of the center, the relaunch. And there's cake. Yes, I was going to tell people. There's cake that I don't want to bring home. So please indulge just outside in the lobby. Thank you so much for being here. Check out our site, sign up for Co-ops 101, and stay in touch.